Hey there folks, the number one Bad Company fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with the first entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. Now, if you haven't been here since basically the beginning of this channel's existence, then chances are you probably don't know what the Rock Hall Reviews series is, considering I haven't done it since 2022, but it is a supposedly yearly series that I only did once, where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, one album from each of them, review it, talk about their chances of getting into the Hall of Fame, as well as if I think they deserve it, so on and so forth. The title of this series is pretty self-explanatory, if I'm being completely real with you. I did it once in 2022, the first year that I had this channel and was posting here. And then in 2023, I got busy, so I didn't do it. And then in 2024, I didn't do it because, what are you, a cop? Do I have to give you answers for everything? I don't know, I just didn't feel like doing it. But this year, I do feel like doing it, and it's a really cool thing that I decided to do it in alphabetical order, because that means the first band I have to talk about is Bad Company. Arguably the least interesting nominee of the entire list this year. Not the worst, but probably tied with Joe Cocker for the one with the least to talk about. But without further ado, let's talk about Bad Company's sophomore studio album from 1975, Straight Shooter. I think it goes without saying that the main highlight here is Paul Rodgers, the frontman of Bad Company. I mean, I won't lie and act like he's the greatest vocalist to ever grace popular music, but, you know, at the same time, I do think he's among the better sort of arena rock, mainstream rock vocalists that came out of the early to mid-70s, when a lot of pretty god-awful stuff within similar territory was definitely being released. He's definitely much more earnest than a Lou Gramm or Dennis DeYoung type of individual, and I mean, yeah, you know, I just think he's one of the better of his kind overall. I mean, the guy has energy and charisma, no question, and the gruffness of his voice kind of suits the more blues rock, bluesy edge that Bad Company had from the start and still had at this point in their earlier days, that some of their stadium level peers like Foreigner and REO Speedwagon just simply didn't have, leaving a lot of their music feeling much more limp by comparison to Bad Company's work here. Not to say that this record's particularly special or anything, because if I'm being real, it's, you know, not, but at the same time, it definitely does feel like there's more meat on the bone here than there is on a lot of other records put out by similar bands to Bad Company, both stylistically and in terms of commercial success. The blues influence, of course, isn't really a surprise when you consider the fact that Paul Rodgers originally came from the band Free before becoming a member of Bad Company, Free being the same band that drummer Simon Kirke on this record originally came from, and one of those bands that I kind of lump alongside groups like Humble Pie and Foghat as pretty forgettable and unremarkable blues rock bands of the era that don't really have much of substance beyond the singles, but I digress. My opinions on a different band that I'm not even talking about today being set aside, it is that sort of bluesy rootage that gave Bad Company a sort of uniqueness, a sort of edge over the competition, and makes me stray from calling them an AOR band in the same way that I would refer to a band like Boston in that way. And I mean, Bad Company is more of a predecessor to something like Blues Traveler than it is to something like Toto, and I mean, I find both of those sounds and styles, generally speaking, pretty equally milquetoast overall, but I don't think that Bad Company should ever be confused as being a stadium rock band in the same way that some of the more corny groups of the era were, because Bad Company weren't corny. They didn't feel disingenuous, at least not by the mid-70s. They just kind of felt boring, and that's really the main thing that they had going for them. A handful of excellent singles and albums that left a lot to be desired for anyone who wanted a full-length listening experience that really matched that same level of quality and excitement, but unfortunately the deep cuts here just really don't do much. Guitarist Mick Ralphs is also here, someone who had also proven himself in a different band prior to Bad Company, this being kind of a supergroup in that sense, although I feel people never really recognize that about Bad Company, but I digress. Mick Ralphs, originally coming from Mott the Hoople, a competent and pretty capable guitarist overall, but I vastly prefer his work with Mott, if I'm being completely honest. With Mott, he still felt like he was pretty raw and a bit more loose, but at the same time not totally sloppy or out of time or anything like that, whereas outside of the two biggest songs from this record, Shooting Star and Feel Like Making Love, really the only two standout tracks on the entirety of Straight Shooter for me personally, I don't really think he shines here that much. A lot of his work here feels pretty interchangeable with a lot of other stadium-level rock guitarists of the era. He doesn't necessarily have any particular tone or swing or anything like that that really makes him feel like a highly distinct guitarist that stands out among the crowd of his particular generation of mainstream rock guitarists. I'm not asking him to go all sorts of jazz fusion meets avant-prog Frank Zappa level experimentation, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like he really has enough weight behind his guitar work to be classified as one of the heavier guitarists of the era. He doesn't really play enough of a technical or fast way to be considered one of the more complex guitarists of the era. He's just sort of there, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but considering how many bands sounded like Bad Company throughout the entirety of the 1970s, slightly into the early 1980s, I don't know, I guess I kind of look for something that feels a little more remarkable and distinct, and unfortunately with Ralph's guitar work, I just don't really find that here. And I mean, yeah, the deeper cuts here, honestly, they just don't feel that memorable. Weep No More is just a real snoozer for me. Wildfire Woman is unmemorable, as is the song Anna, and Call on Me. It just kind of feels like self-indulgence from a band that don't know how to execute self-indulgence correctly. I mean, it's just that Bad Company aren't the kind of band that could make a 6-minute song and not make it feel overdramatic and masturbatory, and that's exactly what Call on Me does end up feeling like. It's certainly not a great way to close out a record that already wasn't really particularly excellent in the first place. And I mean, really, outside of the singles, the only halfway solid cut here is the track Deal with the Preacher, which admittedly sort of has a classic 50s rock and roll tear it up kind of style of energy to it that I can admire and appreciate, despite the fact I don't think it's that great of a song. I just think it's a pretty solid track that should be the expectation for the average deep cut from a 70s singles band, but, you know, I digress. This whole album, it just, I feel that this is a lot more reflective of the stadium rock era in terms of structure than it is in terms of sound. A couple of really solid singles, in this case with Shooting Star, one really great single, excellent song, Bad Company at their peak there in my opinion, and then not much else. It just so happens that the singles here are a little bit better than what you might expect from other bands similar to Bad Company, but as it stands, Straight Shooter, I just feel like it doesn't have a lot going for it. It's a step down from their debut album, which is just fine as is, and honestly, I think it was a sign of what was to come, because it was pretty much all downhill after this. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. So then comes the ever-important question: will Bad Company get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2025? Yes. Yeah, they will. Yes, I can guarantee it. If the Bad Company do not make it into this institution this year, I will eat a piece of paper in my next video. Just full-on paper, crumpled up, I'll let it sit in my mouth and disintegrate. I promise you that. I will do this, because there is no possible way that this institution that loves to honor the most C-list, D-list rock bands of the 1970s would pass up on one of the most popular bands of those kinds that they have yet to induct. I mean, still, Bad Company remain a classic rock radio staple, and as a whole, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame loves artists like that. There's a reason that Foreigner and Peter Frampton, of all people, got in last year. It's because the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame knows its audience, and I'm probably the youngest person watching this video, and that's just because I made this video. I have to watch it to edit it. So, you know, as a whole, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame knows its audience. Bad Company will absolutely get in 100%. Do they deserve it, though? You know, I feel like that's a different story altogether. Look, I don't hate Bad Company whatsoever, and I do understand why a lot of people consider Paul Rodgers to be one of the great mainstream rock vocalists of his era of music. But, you know, at the same time, I don't know, like I said, this is just sort of a D-list band in my opinion. If the backlog wasn't so massive for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I'd say, you know what, yeah, sure, go ahead. Toss them in there, I got no problem with that. But I don't know, when, like, Joy Division, who was also nominated this year, still aren't in, when some of the most influential alternative bands of all time have never even been nominated, when you're still digging barely into the surface of rap/hip-hop, Outkast finally getting their first nomination this year, so on and so forth, I don't know, I just feel like Bad Company's a marginal inductee when there are a plethora of other eligible artists that absolutely deserve it. Honestly, I would have replaced Bad Company, along with several other artists nominated this year, which I'll get to when I get to their respective videos, with other newly eligible artists that honestly probably deserve it more. If you're not going to go for some classic bands from this particular era of music that probably deserve it more, then hell, why not go with some newer artists that are just becoming eligible? You could do Coldplay. Linkin Park became eligible this year, and they're arguably the most popular rock band of the century so far. Do you get what I'm saying? It's just that I don't think Bad Company are a bad band, and I think that they're a fine choice for induction in the grander scheme of things, but as a whole, I don't know, I just don't really see why they deserve it now at this point, when so many other artists are still waiting for some sort of recognition or induction, or even just a nomination. And with that being said, that is the end of the very first episode of this year's Rock Hall Review series. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.